for joining us tonight for the discussion. Peta didn't mention that while she and Mike and Danielle and the other comrades were in Anaheim immediately and working with the community and helping the community as it was confronting the police, our signs were very visible. Answer Coalition, our comrades were interviewed, and then a few hours later, Glenn Beck put up a message on his website. The Stalinist Answer Coalition is stimulating rebellions against the police, and other right-wing websites did that. And then our office got deluged with racist, fascist calls, threatening calls, mainly, it sounded to us like they were, well, I wouldn't say off-duty police, just police. And then a few hours afterwards, our office was broken into and completely ransacked. And everything was taken. All the computers were taken, the sound equipment was taken, the bullhorns were taken. I don't know what the street value is of bullhorns, but in other words, it didn't appear as a perfectly normal burglary. The files were ransacked. The office was basically turned upside down. And clearly a message was being sent that they were the powers that be, probably the cops or some sector of the police, were trying to stop us or intimidate us. But these same comrades, Peta and Mike and Danielle, they were back in Anaheim that day with the people. And even though we had no computers, we had nothing left, we immediately went back into action, giving the same sort of support for the community. And that says a lot about what we are as an organization. We have a political program that says we're for socialism, we're against capitalism, we're for peace, we're against war, we're against racism. But these can be just words. And what really makes a difference is not the words per se, but the deed. What do people do? Is the political program meaningful in the sense that it's the thing that takes us into activity against the forces of oppression that are the consequence, not, as Peta said, of a bad cop or even a bad police department, but of a system of capitalism, the capitalist social and economic order that breeds racism, that breeds police brutality, that manifests it. Are we able to take this program and put it into action? Because all the political programs and all the political rhetoric in the world won't be the thing that changes the political scene in the United States or anywhere else. It requires people engaged in struggle. And this party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, is a party of struggle. And my talk tonight, my presentation tonight, our assessment of the current economic situation also has that sort of foundational premise that we're analyzing the situation not because it's interesting, not because we're trying to show we know what we're talking about, but because we want to understand the problem to help our class, the working families of America, go into action to carry out profound social change. That's our plan. Now, I also want to mention, you may have seen when you came in that we have a new pamphlet. It's this pamphlet right here. It's called Wanted, and it's got a picture of 6 bankers: J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Barclays, the CEOs of the 6 biggest banks. And the title of the pamphlet is The Myth of Democracy and the Rule of the Banks. And this just came out. It's actually literally just off the press, and we hope everyone gets a copy of this pamphlet tonight. And we hope that people also study the pamphlet. If you're a student, start a study group with fellow students. This is an easily accessible, easy to read political document about the capitalist banks. And when you talk to most people about the economy, their eyes just immediately glaze over. They think, oh, I don't understand these terms. I don't understand how Wall Street works. It just seems like this mystical mess. And of course, no issue affects people more than the economy, and yet the mystique about the economy, as if only bankers and stockbrokers and corporate lawyers could possibly understand it, that's part of the political process that disenfranchises large millions of people, in fact, who need desperately to know how the system works. They know how it works. You don't have to really read a book to know that you're being screwed. But this book and the literature helps people understand the process and the mechanism of how the capitalist system works. I want to just, in the beginning of my talk, read from the first page of the pamphlet, which you'll hopefully all buy tonight. In October 2008, the U.S. government rescued the biggest banks at the cost of $700 billion in taxpayers' money. It was the biggest bailout in history. The government provided trillions of dollars, that's in addition to the $700 billion, more in loan guarantees and other benefits to the major banks, insurance companies, and other corporations. A couple of months later, a reporter, this was an Associated Press reporter, called the banks and talked to all of them. The responses were nearly the same. Thomas Kelly, J.P. Morgan Chase, recipient of $25 billion, quote, they're asking, what did you do with the money? How did you spend the money that you were given? Quote, we have not disclosed that to the public. We are declining to. Kevin Hine, Bank of New York Mellon, got $3 billion. Quote, we're choosing not to disclose that. Carissa Ramirez, Morgan Stanley, they received $10 billion. Quote, we're going to decline to comment on your story. And so it went. This reporter called all the banks that got bailed out, and none of them chose to disclose to the public what it was they did with the money. I mean, that's an amazing capacity for the banks to get $700 billion, no strings attached, and when asked to decline, sort of in a gentlemanly way, to decline to talk about what it was they were doing with the money. Well, that year, as this pamphlet shows, 5,000 bankers from these same banks that got the $700 billion gave themselves $1 million up to $30 million in annual bonuses for the good work that they had performed in that same year. 5,000 bankers got $1 million in bonus or more in that year. Now, when you ask anybody, what is the nature of the United States? Describe the political system that we live in, people will say all sorts of different things. It won't be precise, especially if you ask a few people. But certain words will pop up. You say, is it a democracy? Yes. Well, what makes it a democracy? Well, the fact that we get to vote every 4 years or 2 years. Is it a free market economy? Yes, it's a free market economy. It's an economy based on private property. Is it a free society? Yes, it's a free society because you can actually say whatever you want. Nobody's going to arrest you if you go out on the street corner and say almost anything. If some things they would arrest you, but almost anything. So people would say, yes, it's a free country. But this first passage of the bank for us as Marxists, as socialists, helps in a very popular way explain what the true character is of this society. If the government, without the consent of the people, can overnight give $700 billion to the banks, and the banks can, quote, decline to discuss what they did with the money, that shows that the banks and not the government actually run society. The banks, in fact, are the masters of the social and economic order called capitalism. That wasn't always the case. The banks were not always the central, phenomenal leaders of the capitalist economic order. That has only been true for about the last 80 or 90 years. But it definitely is true today. As a consequence of the capitalist economic crisis caused by the bankers' own fraud and greed and sheer profit-taking, the number of banks declined. A whole bunch of them went bankrupt. Today, there are 4 banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citibank, and Wells Fargo, which own half of all mortgage debt and 2/3 of all credit card debt in the country. 4 banks. In the last 30 years, this process has shown itself with great systematic regularity. The 10 biggest banks 30 years ago controlled about 30%, no, 22% of bank assets in the country. Today, they control 60%. There is a complete centralization of money power by these banks. The 4 banks that I mentioned, they each have assets of more than $1 trillion. Okay, so $1 trillion doesn't really mean anything to anybody because nobody knows what $1 trillion is. So just to help explain what $1 trillion is 1,000 billions, and 1 billion is 1,000 million. So what's the difference? The math teachers can help here, but what's the difference between 1 million and 1 billion? If you spend $3,000 a day, every day for 3 years, you will have spent $1 million. $3,000 a day for 3 years, you spend $1 million. If you want to spend $1 billion, you have to spend $3,000 a day, not for 30 years or 300 years, but for 3,000 years. That's the difference between 1 billion and 1 million. In other words, if you spend $3,000 ever since the day Jesus Christ was born until today, you would not have spent $1 billion. But by 3 AD, you would have spent $1 million. So these banks have $1 trillion, not 1 billion, but 1,000 billions. These 4 banks have greater assets than most of the country's gross domestic product in the world, around the world. They have phenomenal wealth. When they couldn't pay their debts, they went to the U.S. government, and they said to the U.S. government and to all of the politicians of both parties, if you don't rescue us now by opening the spigot and giving us, it really wasn't $700 billion, it was really $7 trillion because they gave loan guarantees and other credit remedies that was basically free money to the banks. In other words, a government guarantee for up to $7 trillion in loan. If you don't do this, we, the biggest banks, the center of capitalism, will go into complete paralysis, which is true. They were in complete paralysis. And without the U.S. government using our money to bail them out, the capitalist system would not have had the Great Recession. The capitalist system would have frozen. It would have shut down. It would have gone through the biggest economic contraction in the history of capitalism, much greater than what happened in the 1930s. And yet, when they became the recipients of this money that kept them afloat, the government put circles around JP Morgan and Chase and Citi and Wachovia, Wells Fargo, whatever you want to call it now, Wells Fargo, I guess. And they said, these banks are too big to fail. And as a consequence, they did not fail. They survived because the government came to their rescue. You know, when you hear the propaganda of what is the difference between socialism and capitalism, you hear a socialist economy is run by the government and a capitalist economy is run by entrepreneurs who take risks with their own money, and the incentive to get rich, to maximize profit, to become the holders of fortune is such a motivator that they set the wheels of production in motion, and thus we get all kinds of things like a new iPhone every 9 months. Yeah. You know, things that we just could not live without. Like that's the brilliance of capitalism, where socialism is a government-run economy. It's sluggish. The people are idle because they don't have the incentive to get rich. There's not the same sort of dynamic output that capitalism has. Now, that's the argument. So let's take a look at this economic crisis and sort of examine those core arguments of what is socialism, what is capitalism, and see, does that correspond in any way to reality? Now, of course, you can make the argument right away, the first argument, that if capitalism is a government, is an economic order driven by private entrepreneurial spirit and the allocation of private capital and risk, well, then the government shouldn't have intervened. But if it hadn't intervened, the capitalist system and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, the bankers in particular, would have gone down. So clearly, the capitalist system relies on the government. The government came in and bailed out the banks. And without that, the capitalist system would fail. So it's not true that capitalism is a system of private entrepreneurial work as opposed to government intervention. There is government intervention. There's also government intervention at other levels. The U.S. has 900 military bases all around the world in 130 countries. Those military bases exert huge influence in the economies of all of those countries. They make sure that the first in line for contracts, or right in the top of the line, are American corporations. I mean, that's why the bases exist. It's not because the Pentagon actually fears that the United States is going to be invaded by Turkmenistan or Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, the last time the United States mainland was invaded was the War of 1812. It's not an imminent threat. But those bases everywhere are a form of government intervention for the sake and the benefit of corporate profit for the capitalists. Okay, so so we can see it's not like one system has government intervention and the other doesn't. They both have government intervention. In the case of the capitalist system, the banks got bailed out. We know that, the biggest banks. And then what happened? The economy contracted. So many people lost their jobs. 30 to 40 million is the real number who lost their jobs. 30 to 40 million human beings who are adult, employable people who are not working. So their kids are not working either, meaning they're not working either because they're completely unemployed or they're seriously underemployed. And according to U.S. government statistics, you know, if I am unemployed but I go and mow my neighbor's lawn and he gives me $10, I'm underemployed. I'm not unemployed. So the real numbers, about 30 to 40 million people, about 20% of the workforce. Those people lost their jobs, and as a consequence, many of them couldn't pay the debt they owed to the same banks. And the banks turned around and immediately said, well, if you can't pay your mortgage, we're going to foreclose you. 10 million households since then, since 2008, have either been foreclosed or threatened with foreclosure because the people are so seriously delinquent in their mortgage payment. The same people. The government did not come in to say to the banks, you cannot evict or steal or take the homes of those homeowners. Not at all. 4 million families have actually been foreclosed since then. 4 million. 4 million families, which means when you count the kids, it's about 20 million people have been put out. 1% of the U.S. population, 3.5 million people, will be completely homeless this year. That's an official statistic and verified and validated as a conservative number even by those who specialize in care for the homeless. That doesn't include people who are doubling up, who have lost their apartments, lost their homes, and are doubling up and tripling up with their families. They're not considered homeless. I'm talking about people who are absolutely homeless. 3.5 million. At the same time, government did not intervene to bail them out. Now, students, you know, $1 trillion in student debt. Who holds that debt? The banks. Same banks that just got bailed out. The U.S. government in 2006 passed additional regulation that makes it impossible for you to go bankrupt on your student debt. You can never escape student debt. For people who are over 60 years old in America, there's an aggregate $36 billion in owed student debt. That means you're going to go to the grave with student debt, your whole life with student debt. And if you can't get a job because the bankers destroyed the economy, you really can't get it, but you can't declare that, you can't declare bankruptcy. As a matter of fact, when you're 62 years old and you are eligible for that low payment of Social Security and you still have your student debt, according to a law passed by Bill Clinton, introduced by Clinton, introduced and passed and signed into law by Clinton in 1996, they can garnish your wages, your Social Security benefits for up to 15% to pay the banks for your student loans that you incurred 45 years earlier. Again, there's no government intervention except to facilitate that transfer of wealth from the working class to the banks. Now, there's government intervention in other ways, too. You know, the government says the ladder of law has no top and no bottom. Well, that's actually a line from a Bob Dylan song, so the government doesn't say that. But that's what they mean. The justice system treats all equally. A rich man and a poor man will be treated equally before the law when they steal a loaf of bread. You know, the rich frequently steal a loaf of bread. But, okay, let's say they did. They'll all be treated equally once they're in court. So look at some of the other statistics. Again, government-bank relationship. Now, 40,000 people have died in Mexico as a result of the so-called drug war. That really is promoted by the U.S. government. Now, there's also, on this side of the Mexican-U.S. border, 2.5 million human beings who are incarcerated. If you include those who are on probation and parole, the real number is about 7 million are somehow chained to the criminal justice system. The disproportionate number are African American and Latino. Many of them are in prison because of drugs. The mandatory minimum sentence in most states for possession of $358 of cocaine or more is a minimum sentence of 5 to 10 years. Now, we have 2.5 million people in prison. But, you know, up in between 1776, when the American Revolution started, and 1976, the total number, as it grew exponentially in the 50s, 60s, and especially the 70s, the number of people in prison was 1 million. But within 30 years, it became 2 million. 30 years. It took 200 years to get to 1 million and 30 years to get to 2 million. The government really is doing its job, enforcing the law. The law has it has its blinders on. Again, no top and no bottom to that ladder. And you know, if you've been arrested even for a minor crime, you can't get a job. It's very hard to get a job. You can't get an apartment. 90% of the people in prison never went to trial. Because once you're busted by the cops, once they confront you with heavy charges, you plead out. You don't have legal counsel. You can't really defend yourself. You plead out. You go to prison. That's the government in its intervention on the question of drugs. Now take another point of intervention. Last year, before it merged with Wells Fargo, the CEO and board of directors of Wachovia admitted that between 2004 and 2007, the bank laundered $378 billion in drug money, most of it coming from Mexico and Central America. $378 billion. Wachovia, now Wells Fargo, settled the case with an agreement to pay $110 million fine and $50 million more, $160 million. That's exactly 0.04% of the $378 billion that they admitted that they laundered in drug money in those 3 years, 2004 to 2007. In April 2011, the federal prosecutors announced that they were suspending further criminal investigations on Wachovia for its laundering of drug money. And then this April, they announced the case is closed. So Wachovia knowingly laundered $378 billion of drug money. Not one Wachovia member of the board of directors, the CEO, or any other official went to jail, was ever charged with a criminal offense. And the fine was nothing, and they don't have to pay it. So the government is intervening again, but always on behalf of the banks. No banker goes to jail for any crime. In 1989, in 1990, 1991, there was the great savings and loan crisis, similar, very similar to what happened with the crisis between 2003 and 2008. The creation of a bubble, that time around real estate also, but mostly commercial real estate. During that period, there were 10,000 criminal referrals to the Justice Department for criminal investigations of bankers during the 1989 savings and loan crisis. You know how many criminal referrals there are for what just happened in 2008? You know, the one that left 40 million people unemployed? 0. 10,000 criminal referrals in the Justice Department and 1,000 convictions in 1989. This time, 0 referrals, 0 convictions. So we can see the trend that as the concentration of wealth has become so intense, where the banks possess so much wealth and possess so much power that goes with the wealth, and are such the dominant force over the government, that they now rely on the government to intervene exclusively on their behalf. And when the government went through all of these losses because it gave the banks money, losses because the unemployed couldn't pay taxes, losses because of so much of a decline in the economy, tens of thousands, really hundreds of thousands of municipal workers, state workers, and municipal workers around the country are losing their jobs now because of the crisis created by the banks in 2008. So we have a situation where modern-day monopoly capitalism, monopolized, concentrated wealth, has privatized the profits from society, privatized them completely for this handful of bankers, and socialized, meaning given to society, all of the risk associated with the investments and capitalist transactions of the banks. So the capitalist system is a socialist system, except for all of the money is privately held by the bankers. Everything else is socialized by the government. All of the costs belong to the people. The profit belongs to the bankers. Now, that injustice doesn't mean that the capitalist system is in danger. Because, you know what? No matter how unjust capitalism is, the capitalist system won't die by itself. They're never going to say, you know what? They're not going to have some epiphany and say, God, this is such an awful, unethical, immoral, anti-human system. Let's commit like social suicide. They're not going to do that. We know that. Nor are the wheels of capitalist exploitation going to suddenly grind to a halt. Marxism does not believe, even though we believe in the inevitability of socialism, we don't believe that the capitalist system will inevitably stop working somehow. You know why it won't stop working? Because every day, those who don't have jobs, or those who need jobs, will go to work, and they will give over to the bosses their labor or their ability to labor, their labor power every day in exchange for wages, because if we don't get wages, if we don't have wages or a salary, we can't eat. That's what Marx meant when he said modern capitalism has replaced chattel slavery, whereby the slave, the worker, was owned outright by the slave owner, with wage slavery, whereby the proletarian or the working classes are enslaved as a class, because if they cannot work, meaning if they cannot be exploited by a capitalist, they have no place to go. No one's going to take care of them. And so they are slaves to wages. And they will go to work no matter what, because we must eat. We must help our children eat. We must have food and clothing and shelter. So the capitalist system, no matter how oppressive it's become, no matter how many are unemployed, no matter how many students can't pay their debts, no matter how many people entering Social Security will have their Social Security benefits garnished because they couldn't pay their student debt, no matter how bad it is, the capitalist system will keep grinding on. The only way that capitalism stops is when the people rise up and expropriate the banks, nationalize the banks, seize the banks, say to the bankers that you are not only a superfluous class, something that doesn't create, it only steals, it takes, or gambles with the money of society for your own enrichment. You offer nothing constructive, and take that money and those assets and do with it that which society needs, which is to provide every human being employment at a decent wage, and every young person and adult the right to go to school for free, and the right of every sick person or well person who doesn't want to get sick to go to a doctor free of charge, and allows that money to be used so that education up to and through the secondary level is completely free. Unless we seize those banks, unless we take the power, unless we take the system and reorganize it, the capitalist system of oppression will grind on and on and on, and the government will be there as its adjunct, as its prop. And if the Democrats get elected, it will be its prop. And if the Democrats or the Republicans get elected, it will still be its prop. The government, under the control of the two ruling class parties, will be nothing but the servant of the banks and the bankers. So the question for us is, how can we do that? How can we seize the banks? What does it even mean to seize the banks? That's our program. The 10-point program of the Lindsay Osario campaign and of the PSL has, number one, seize the banks and use those assets in order to give every worker, every person a job, every person to cancel student debt, and to make sure there's no foreclosures from all the people who can't pay the banker's debt right now. How do you do that? You can only do that, sisters and brothers, if we build a socialist movement. This concept of socialism does not occur to people as a spontaneous, sort of instinctively arrived at conclusion based on oppression and exploitation. You can oppress people day after day after day, and it won't necessarily occur to them that the bank should be seized. Now, all over the world, socialism and communism is a pretty popular notion. I mean, when in Europe and Latin America, and certainly in Asia, but here in the United States, socialism, which was a widely popular movement, still a minority movement, but a widely popular movement in the 30s and 40s, became ostracized as a consequence of the witch hunt of the 1950s. I'm not going to go into all of that, but as we have made the point in the past, anti-communism became an article of faith, like a religion, like the unofficial religion of America, just for the purpose so that when capitalist crisis becomes so pronounced, the working class doesn't immediately think, yes, we need a socialist solution. In fact, they have been taught that socialism is an alien theory. It belonged in the past to other powers like the Soviet Union, which had thermonuclear weapons pointed at U.S. cities, Or the People's Republic of China, also labeled for decades as an enemy state, as a national security threat. Or Cuba, same. For that whole period in which the anti-communist sort of cascade descended upon the working classes of America, the United States was engaged in a struggle with countries that were also socialist governments, or governments that had a socialist perspective. And so the United States government convinced a big part of the masses of people that socialism was the ideology of a foreign and threatening power. And as a consequence of that, anti-communism became deeply rooted in the United States. So deeply rooted that Obama is called a socialist by the Republicans because he adopted a Republican health care plan. I mean, he adopted the Republican idea, which was make everybody buy insurance from capitalist insurance companies, and in exchange, you won't be completely neglected. Now, that was the Republican plan. The American Enterprise Institute supported it. The Heritage Foundation, of course, we know Mitt Romney supported it and implemented it in Massachusetts. It was against the idea of the majority of the people. In March 2009, when President Obama came into office, the New York Times ran a survey that showed that 77% of Americans favored single-payer health plan, meaning like Medicare for all, meaning eliminating the insurance companies as part of the equation. Instead of paying a huge part of our money to insurance companies, they're cut out. Now, in spite of that, he adopted the Republican plan. And so what did the Republicans do? Called him a socialist. And you know, a large part of the country actually believes that Obama is a socialist. I mean, they're not the people who are coming to our meetings, but nonetheless, they're not a small number either. And they believe that that is socialism. I mean, socialism is the go-to caricaturing, stereotypical, hostile word with which you can discredit anything. And so, like when we were leading the anti-war movement in the United States in 2003, 2004, hundreds of thousands of people were coming to our demonstrations, and the Washington Post would put a microphone in front of me and say, Brian, is it true that you're a Marxist? I'm like any other country in the world, the idea that Marxists would not be in the anti-war movement would be considered completely bizarre and absurd. But in America, it's like, are you a socialist? Like, yes, of course we're socialists. And probably hundreds of thousands of people who are coming to the demonstrations also agree with our program. They may not want to say they're socialists because of the impact, the negative impact, but yeah, but that was how it is. And so you see all these socialists are self-censoring. They want to say, well, if you get on TV, are you a socialist? Well, we're fighting for peace. We want jobs. We want health care for all. Like every element of socialism. But, well, are you a Michael Moore made the movie Capitalism, a Love Story, and he was on Democracy Now!, not a hostile radio show for him. And they said at the end, are you a socialist? And he said, well, I'm overweight. And they said, in other words, like he couldn't say the word socialist. So how can socialism ever grow in an anti-communist country, a country that's ravaged by all of these crises, if the socialists are so afraid to be socialists or communists? And communism is just, socialism for us is the first stage of communism. And what does it mean to be a socialist? It means take the money from the banks and say to every human being when you're born, when you get out of school, you're going to have a job at a decent wage. That's a guaranteed legal right. That's the first step of socialism. It means you will never pay a doctor's bill again. It means instead of paying a mortgage to the bank, and by the time you finish your mortgage payment for anybody who's had a mortgage, you pay the banks twice what the house is worth. You say, no more banks. The house belongs to you straight away. Now, frankly, brothers and sisters, You could have 80 or 90% of homeowners be virulently anti-communist, but if we took power and said you don't have to make any more mortgage payments, they would say, this is a good government. They would immediately understand that socialism was a good thing. But we're not there, so it's hard to offer the benefit. In other words, you say to the socialist program that the things that are necessary for life are guaranteed. Why? Because the government does intervene, but it intervenes for the workers, for the people, instead of for the banks. And we say, nationalize the banks and seize them and create one people's bank. It does no speculation, it makes no profits, investors get nothing, it just helps facilitate and extend credit so that that which needs to be built can be built, that which needs to be repaired can be repaired, that which needs to be sustained can be sustained. If people believe in those things, you are a communist. You might not have thought you were a communist when you woke up this morning, but if you believe in jobs for all and free education and affordable housing, if you believe in those things, that's the program of communism. And we have to identify it as the message of socialism so that as we go forward in organizing our people, and they are organizing, they want to fight. We saw that with the Occupy movement. We see it over and over again. People want to fight, they want to struggle. But every social movement goes up and down. You see Occupy, they got dislodged by the government. They carried out all those raids against the Occupy encampment. 7,000 people were arrested. The places were dislodged, and the movement has ebbed now. Are we going to just go endlessly up and down and up and down and up and down, or do we have to have a political program, a political message that in spite of the movement going up or down, we attract new adherents to understand that the only alternative to capitalism, the rule of the banks, as this pamphlet says, is the advent of a real people's democracy, meaning socialism, the first stage of human liberation, the first stage where human beings come first, and the elimination of corporate profit as part of the equation. Thank you.